The Eureka Jane Doe, also known as Torso Girl, identified as Carrie Ann Cummings. In October of 1997, a duck hunter was out traveling along a muddy bank near a beach located in McKinleyville, California, and it was here he discovered would be the first partial remains of a woman. Her torso was found north of Eureka, which is also in California, and other parts were found in a wooded area near Trinidad, California. It would take DNA in the end to link them all together, and they were scattered mainly in a 36-mile area, or 58 kilometers. Unlike so many of these cases, they believe they know who did it. I don't like to talk very much about serials, as it feels like I'm giving them a platform and I don't want to. So I'm just going to give a limited amount of information, and if you want to Google him and find out more, his name is Wayne Allen Ford. In this case, he admitted he'd done it, and he would say that she was hitchhiking when he picked her up. He would say that she was from either Arizona, Colorado, or New Mexico, and that he believed she left home because she was upset over either a relationship problem or a child custody case. No one has been able to verify his statements, so take it with a grain of salt. It's known that between October of 1997 and November of 1998, Ford took the lives of at least 4 women, and it's believed they were either hitchhikers or working girls, which is just way too often a population that's targeted. Also, it's a group that's some of the most difficult to identify. This specific degenerate was arrested on November 3rd, 1998, and he actually surrendered himself by going into a police station, and when he was arrested, it was said that he had a female body part located somewhere on his person. He was homeless, and they were able to go to his encampment, and more body parts were found. He was eventually found guilty in 2006 of the first-degree M-word, ending up on death row in San Quentin in California. Investigators kept trying, and they never gave up on his victims. Our Jane Doe was identified in June of 2023, and it appears she was the last one that needed to be identified. I started to lay out their stories too, but decided instead just to provide their names. I might do this at another time, but I don't want to take away from this particular person's story. It just feels like she deserves the focus to be on her. When they began doing the forensic genealogy, they were pretty lucky, and it came pretty close to her. Usually, they're farther away on the branches and have to work their way forward, so it was very lucky. When they approached that person stated that a family member named Carrie Cummings had been missing since the mid-1990s. The authorities would take this information and approach Carrie's sister, Kathy. Kathy would offer a sample of her own DNA, and this was used to confirm that Carrie Ann Cummings once again had her name. Carrie was born in 1972 and was just around 25 when she went missing. Her family describes her as a wonderful young woman. Carrie was beautiful, funny, smart, and an artist. She was great at making us laugh. Carrie's sister, Kathy, told investigators it's devastating what mental illness can do in a span of only 2 years. Carrie was not reported missing, but in this case, it was not for lack of trying. As I've mentioned before, I've run across people saying they tried to report a missing person, but the police refused to take the report, saying adults have a right to go missing should they choose to do so. This happened in many, but not all jurisdictions. In this case, Carrie's family was told by the police that there were laws in place that wouldn't let her be reported missing. I tried to dig into this a little, but I didn't find any proof of actual laws, and this is the first time I've come across that. It's policy and not laws, usually, that keep them from taking the report. While I didn't find proof of an actual older law, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Although honestly, I suspect it was meant to keep the peace while not taking a report. Because there was no standard database, in a lot of the cases it wouldn't probably have made a difference. I should say, though, that not all jurisdictions refuse to take reports, but it was quite a few of them. And even now, there's sometimes problems if someone is a chronic runaway in getting a report taken. The tough thing is you need the report in order to match up remains that are found. While they don't list what the mental health diagnosis was in Carrie's case, it's pretty clear she was seriously struggling at the time. The last time Carrie called home, her family was aware that she was living in Eugene, Oregon, and at that time she was couch surfing. For those in other countries that might not understand the phrase, it just means she was staying for free on people's couches when allowed. Her family tried talking her into coming home, but she refused. And, of course, she was an adult, so they couldn't make her. So, in the end, they spent 25 years hoping against hope that Carrie was still alive and doing okay. Because they couldn't report her missing, they opted to hire a private investigator. Unfortunately, as hard as the PI tried, he also could not locate her. Kathy would say they approached the police more than once in hopes of making a report, and at what point we're told Kerry had chosen the lifestyle she was in, and that if she wasn't a threat to herself or others, there was nothing that could be done. Her family took to regularly searching NamUs themselves, looking for mention of the tattoo that she had. Because they removed the NamUs profiles, there's no way for me to look if the tattoo is listed on there, but I've noticed they don't always end up on the website, and often it's mentioned, but there's no picture. So it makes it hard. It just depends on the jurisdiction and how much was done that was able to be put into NamUs. I see on the Doe network they list her as 18 to 26. It mentioned a colored dot on her upper thigh, as well as flowers that were around an ankle. They also said that her cervix appeared that she'd given birth to one child, but that hasn't been confirmed, and there's no child listed here. Carrie Ann Cummings went unidentified for 25 years. Had she lived the life she deserved, she would be 50 years old today. She was unidentified for the same amount of years that she spent on this earth. The woman in the trunk, also known as the St. Petersburg Doe, identified as Sylvia Atherton. This story starts on October 31st, 1969, in an area that then housed a business known as the Oyster Bar, located at 4200 34th Street South in St. Petersburg, Florida. It was there that a woman was found who had likely been there for about 2 or 3 days. She had short brown hair, which was about 8 inches in length, and she used bobby pins to fix her hair. They also noted there was a mole on her left cheek and that she had brown eyes. They believed her to be about 25 to 35, saying she also had a small partial upper plate that covered 4 missing teeth. They also noted that she'd had her wisdom teeth removed. She had given birth to at least one child, but they don't believe that was recent. She also had a mild gallbladder disorder, which, for the 20 million of us without our gallbladders, we can attest is pretty normal. It is often, however, pretty painful if you have gallstones, so she may have been in pain. She had 3 small, hairless moles in total, no tattoos, and no scars. She also did not have pierced ears. She was probably around 5'9", or 175 centimeters, weighing about 130 pounds or 58 kilograms. They were able to get DNA and fingerprints, but it led nowhere. One weird aspect was that she was wearing a green shorty-type nightgown with a floral design and lace at the top. Originally, this made me think someone grabbed her from her home or a hotel, wherever she was staying, because she certainly wasn't running around town in this. However, there is more to support that this happened at her home, likely as she had readied for bed. She was found inside of a trunk that was manufactured by the Non-Breakable Trunk Company, and she'd been asphyxiated by 20-inch red bolo tie cord, and she had suffered several blows to her head. The parking lot the trunk was found in was pretty busy, so it's possible that because it was locked, people couldn't open it and they just left it alone. They tried running DNA suitable for genetic genealogy, but they kept hitting walls. Her teeth and her bone samples were degraded. This just highlights how great some of the technology has gotten, because a lot of the DNA had hit brick walls in the past. But in this case, there was a stroke of luck, and the detective discovered some evidence in a box that included a sample of her hair. This is what led to her DNA profile and name, so a huge thanks should go out to Detective Wally Pavelski. And with this, Sylvia Atherton once again had her name. We now know that Sylvia June Atherton was 41 when she went missing from Tucson, Arizona. It was very odd. Something major had to have happened. She wasn't a transient. She wasn't likely to leave home. It was very atypical. And she had 5 kids at home who were counting on her. The assistant police chief went on to say, "This is where we're asking for assistance to kind of put the pieces together and the gaps together. We do know that this trunk was their property. We do know that she was remarried, and we know that her husband at the time passed away in 1999. But up until that time, he never listed her as missing. We know that he never listed her on any bankruptcy records. While he doesn't specifically say it, it sounds like the man had filed for bankruptcy in the past. So it's very shady that Sylvia wasn't reported missing. And while she was found in 1969, it appears she went missing in 1965. So where she was in those middle years is unknown. Her daughter did identify the trunk as definitely having belonged to her mother. Her daughter, Cylin, is thankful that she finally knows what happened to her mother. According to one article, Sylvia left Arizona with her husband, Stuart Brown. It appears that at the time she had a 5-year-old daughter who went to live in Chicago along with an adult daughter named Kimberly, as well as her adult son named Gary. Another adult daughter named Donna and Donna's husband, David Lyndhurst, also appeared to live there. At the time, she had a 9-year-old daughter named Cylin and an 11-year-old son, and those two went to live with their father from a previous marriage. Her daughter Cylin would say it's such a relief to know what had happened to her mom. But there's more concern to be had. She went on to explain that she had a sister and a niece who are missing. Some of the ages are a little mixed up from article to article, so I'm not quite sure. They may have been aged 5 and 20 in 1965, which would make them 63 and 77 today. Though some articles list the sister as 20 and say that this was in 1969. So take this with a grain of salt. They could be 59 and 73 perhaps, but honestly somewhere in the zone of those years. The child mentioned was either 3 or 5 depending on where it's written. The 19-year-old daughter who's missing was named Donna Lyndhurst, and it's believed she went to Arizona eventually to live with her husband David. She and her daughter weren't heard from again by the rest of the family. The sister last left a message with a grandparent in 1969, calling because she believed her brother had been killed in the Vietnam War, but this call was the last time anyone heard from her. If anyone has any information on both Sylvia's case or that of the missing sister and her daughter, please call the number on your screen. Sylvia June Atherton was missing for 57 years and went unidentified for 53. Donna and Kimberly Lyndhurst have been missing for 53 years. The St. Tammany Parish Jane Doe, identified as Paula Boudreau. There isn't a ton on this one. I'm hoping I'll be able to insert information later on. I'm sure my editor's notes sometimes annoy people, but just a heads up. I researched the story and photos initially and set them up. I record the audio, then edit that, and go back and sync it up with the pictures, and probably add more. That's why it ends up as a written note. My house is old and loud with a lot of people in it, so recording audio is a trick, so going back to add something is nearly impossible for me. So unfortunately, it's a note or nothing. In this case, we know that Paula was just 22 in 1986, and a relative had dropped her off at home. It seemed like a normal day, but it wasn't, because it was the last day that anyone admits to seeing Paula. We do know that her remains were found by hunters in a wooded area of St. Tammany Parish in Louisiana, and this was on March 13, 1989. This was 193 miles away from where she went missing, or, for those in other countries, around 310 kilometers. She was found about a year and a half after she disappeared. Paula left behind a 4-year-old son who is now an adult and has children of his own. Both her son and her son's father have been notified of the identification of her remains. But unfortunately, Paula's parents passed in the years that she went unidentified, never knowing that she'd finally been found. It does appear that they have an idea who took Paula's life, or at least they announced they have a person of interest. They haven't said who. Her COD is either not determined or not released yet. Paula went unidentified for 34 years. Had she lived, she would be 56 years old and a grandmother today. The Woodland Cemetery Jane Doe, identified as Edith Patton. This one starts out in Sanford, Maine. A woman's remains were found in 2017, but in actuality they had been there for 126 years, since 1891. Workers were digging at a construction site with the goal of digging a new water line on Main Street in Sanford, Maine. They had planned to build a gas station and a convenience store. I hate that sometimes I sound like a beginning of Bones or a Law and Order episode, but the truth is that, much to their horror, in this case, life imitates TV, or perhaps TV imitates life. Either way, a construction worker did, in fact, react with shock when human remains were found within the dirt. Upon further examination, there was also a casket, but that casket had collapsed. It appears from how it's worded that the weather may have washed the remains away from the casket. Unfortunately, some of the remains were never recovered. Because there was no pelvis found, it was unfortunate that they couldn't even provide an educated guess as to whether or not the person had been male or female. Or at least they felt they couldn't provide that. They did note that there were portions of what appeared to be a Victorian-era casket that included nickel-plated handles and coffin keys. It turns out that the location was the former home of Woodland Cemetery. However, over 100 years ago, in 1900, the town had opted to relocate much of the remains from this site, and this was done in order to construct a school on that very location. By the 1930s, however, what was left intact of the Woodland Cemetery was overgrown and neglected, and it was, of course, no longer being used as its original purpose. No one was being buried there. It was then that the town of Sanford decided to relocate the remaining graves in order to install a playground for the school that was there. The authorities found an article from 1931 that reported that 72 people were relocated to Oakdale Cemetery, which was located about a mile away. It appears in total there had been 77 graves, and they believed all had been moved, except that wasn't what happened. Much like the case I covered on John Barber, who was older and actually surprisingly interesting, the problem is that you can't just respectfully place a person back in the grave without knowing who they were. But DNA is a lot more complicated when you get farther away in the tree. And of course, when someone passed years before, there really isn't a lot of options other than exhuming a possible relative and testing that DNA. One of those in charge of finding out who she was a local historian named Paul Auger. Paul later made the statement, "We want to honor whoever this person was and treat them with respect." And they did. They searched with dedication, eventually finding her name with the help of Parabon nanolabs. At this location, they found her finger bones, jawbone, teeth, and ribs. It was eventually determined that Edith Patton lived from 1867 to 1891. They originally estimated she was 1 decade old. I apologize for wording it weirdly, but YouTube turns off my comments if I mention a younger age. They do it for a valid reason, but this isn't it. And in this case, it turns out she was actually 24 when she passed, although that is unfortunately far too young. If they determined her COD, it's not listed. Sanford, Maine is pretty small. It has about 22,000 people, and as such, they likely had limited means. However, they saw this case as important, and they funded it themselves, finally allowing Edith to be reburied with her real name. Edith Patton went unidentified for 6 years, but had been buried there 126 years before. Edith lived a short life from 1867 to 1891. The Franklin County Jane Doe, identified as Chao Chan. This story begins on September 20th, 1992, in Franklin County, Ohio. A couple went fishing and instead found a man along Big Darby Creek in the vicinity of the 700 block of Lockbourne Road. They believed he was Asian and that the COD was a GS wound. The problem being back in 1992 and 1993 that while DNA was known and it was used, it wasn't what we know today. At the time, they were just first developing the ability to obtain a profile, and at the time when they tried to get one, it failed. They determined him to be around 4'11" to 5'3" tall, or 150 to 160 centimeters. They knew he was wearing both a gold chain and a braided nylon lanyard, and it was that lanyard that had a green stone disc and a pear-shaped medallion. The medallion itself had a painting of Asian women on it. They'd hoped someone would recognize this as it's unusual, but that didn't happen. So not only did the person who did this get away with it, they managed to hide the identity of the man whose life he or she took. We know now that Chao Chan was 19 when he went missing in 1992, and he went missing from New York. This means he was found 556 miles or 895 kilometers away from where he went missing. Genetic genealogy was able to locate first his brother and then his parents, and this one was crowdfunded for the cost. I'd like to be able to share more of Chow's story, but so far it's not showing up. If anything else does, it will appear as an editor's note. Chao Chan went unidentified for 30 years. Had he lived the life he deserved, he would be 49 years old today. If you are at all interested in helping crowdfund John and Jane Doe cases, I've provided links to the DNA Doe Project and DNA Solves below. Both of those allow you to pick the cases you help fund. The South Korean Jane Doe, identified as Carmen Carrillo. One of the more recent DNA identifying projects is that of those representing the U.S. in war and finally bringing them home to their family. North Korea and South Korea were not yet split in the way we know them today. The Second World War would end on September 1st, 1939. At the end of the war, Korea, which had been formerly occupied by the Japanese, was divided along the 38th parallel. This division began when the Japanese were defeated in World War II. After Japan surrendered, there was an understanding that Korea would be liberated from Japan, but as to how that would look was up for debate, and not everybody agreed. It was eventually decided that it would be placed under an international trustee of sorts, to be removed when the Koreans were considered ready for self-rule. The Soviets accepted this division, and as a result, Korea was split. 11 years after the division, the Korean War would take place from 1950 to 1953. At this time, the Soviet Union was siding with North Korea, which was communist, and the West was supporting South Korea. Many considered it a war against international communism. 75,000 soldiers from the North Korean People's Army would cross the boundary into South Korea in June of 1950. This was considered the first military action of the Cold War. A month later, in July of 1950, American troops entered the war on behalf of South Korea. The two sides fought back and forth across the 38th parallel, with both sides suffering a lot of loss, and neither side was winning. By 1953, it was decided that the best option was to settle for an official division between the two. There was a concern that otherwise it would lead to World War III. In the end, a combined 5 million people, including both civilians and soldiers, were lost. The division between the two Korean countries would become permanently divided. President Harry Truman made a statement suggesting that the Soviet Union, which is now of course Russia, would keep right on going and swallowing up one country after another if not stopped, suggesting that for this reason, freedom was actually on the table, whether or not we would all keep it. The weird thing is that in many ways, Russia's behavior today isn't all that different in comparison to the concerns of 75 years ago. Left behind in the Korean War were remains that are still to this day trying to be identified. In this case, the remains of a U.S. serviceman were recovered in 2013, although they wouldn't be identified until 2023. Carmen Carrillo was born on July 28, 1930, and at the age of 10, Carmen moved with his family to Lompoc, California. As soon as he was old enough, he enlisted in the United States Army, eventually being assigned to Headquarters Company, 1st Battalion, 38th Infantry Regiment, 2nd Infantry Division. His unit was deployed to the Korean Peninsula during the Korean War. He was wounded in battle on February 12, 1951, but was able to return to war exactly 2 months later, on April 12, 1951. At this time, he was promoted to the rank of corporal, but he was unfortunately reported missing in action just a month later, on May 17, 1951. The war would go on for 2 more years, but 62 years would pass before his remains were found. No one knew what happened to him. In fact, there was no record of his remains being recovered, nor was he listed as a prisoner of war. After his remains were recovered in 2013, they were shipped back to the U.S., where they were buried and later exhumed for analysis in September of 2021, using both DNA and dental charts in hopes of identification, which of course was successful. Carmen Carrillo was just 20 when his life was lost. Had he lived, he would be 93 years old today. He was missing for 73 years before his remains were identified. I want to thank Carmen Carrillo for his service. May he rest in peace. The Columbia Jane Doe, identified as Virginia Higgins Ray. This case involves a woman that mimics some of the stories that I've covered before of the living John and Jane Does. It's not clear exactly when the decedent was admitted into the South Carolina State Hospital, but we know that she was suffering from schizophrenia, and it was severe enough that she was unable to even give her name, although she did give a date of birth as January 31st, 1944. And this would have made her 38 on February 15th, 1982, at which time she suffered an accident and passed away. Prior to the hospitalization, they said that she'd been wandering the streets and preaching to people. She would tell everyone that she was the daughter of televangelist Oral Roberts. Because they were never able to determine her real identity, she was buried as a Jane Doe, but they didn't give up on identifying her. And the final identification came in May of 2023. And this was after receiving a grant from the Dean and Tina Lynn Klaus Memorial Fund. For those who aren't aware, Dean and Tina were recently identified themselves, and a case I covered here even. And it turns out the Klaus family in part chose to fund this because somebody in their own family had schizophrenia, and that through their tragedy, they helped identify somebody else. This one was a hard one for them to come up with her identity. It led to a small North Carolina community, but it actually was pinpointed on 11 different trees within that community. So they had trouble picking it apart and figuring out who the missing woman was. They did finally come to the conclusion that she was in fact Virginia Clyde Higgins Ray, and she was 38 years old when she passed. And while I don't have her exact date of birth, it does mean that she was the age that she said she was when she passed away. Virginia was raised in Wilkesboro, North Carolina. She married and became a mom, and according to those who knew her, she was a really devoted mother, and they would say she delighted in her children. She was also a devout Christian. Her daughter has been searching for her mother now ever since she was a child. She would go on to say that she's counted 42 Mother's Days that have passed since she went without her mom. She never gave up on finding out what happened to her. It appears that due to her schizophrenia, she ended up in the hospital pretty close to when she went missing from her family. It sounds like she'd been functioning pretty well day to day before whatever that final break was. And there's no indication why she decompensated so fast. An additional point is also the age of onset for schizophrenia is usually younger than this. It usually happens age 16 to 30 or so, but often in the mid-20s is when there are notable changes and people are able to start to pinpoint what is going on. Although, of course, these are always just averages, and someone in my own family actually developed symptoms in her 40s, so you just don't know for sure. Just generally it happens earlier on. Thankfully, the hospital and the state continued trying to identify her. Because this is a really unusual John or Jane Doe type story, I can see how it might have fallen through the cracks, so it's a huge relief that they kept pushing and did all they could to find who she was. When asked about the memories of her mother, one of her children said that, in spite of the decades, all of the children remember her very much the same way, and that they describe as sunshine and picnics, saying when their mom was around, it was always sunny and she was really good to them. Virginia went unidentified for 41 years. Had she lived, she would be 79 years old today. The Miami John Doe, identified as Ronald Gilchrist. Ronald lived at 6933 Bonner Avenue in Clearwater, Florida. He left from his home on October 28, 1980, and it's reported the reason he left is he was doing a favor for his in-laws. He was driving to pick them up at the airport, and he was supposed to transport them then to Marco Island in Florida. The trip itself wasn't super short. It's about 295 miles one way, or about 475 kilometers. We know that he departed his home in Clearwater as expected, driving a 1977 Ford. They know that he called a family member from a restaurant payphone in Mulberry, Florida. Mulberry, Florida is not quite at the halfway mark, though why he called and who hasn't been disclosed. There's a lot of articles out there on this case, but they all pretty much say the same minimal thing. If more information appears, it will show up as an editor's note on the screen. I always do a little more research as I'm syncing up the photos with my audio. All we really know is that he completely disappeared and no one knew where he was. If his car was found, there's no note of this. His COD indicates that he was shot. It's horrible not only in that they wiped his entire name, but then his family had to suffer all this time without knowing what happened. There's just a certain injustice built into this, and so they really need people to come forward if they know anything at all about this case. It's noted that the family has been identified, but they haven't made a statement so far. Ronald Gilchrist went unidentified for 42 years. Had he lived, he would be 72 years old today. The Hale County Jane Doe, identified as Debra Denise Terrell, also known as Debra Mackey. This one starts in the desert outside of Plainview, Texas, in Hale County. She was found on February 16, 1982. It's believed that our Jane Doe was about 4'9" to 5'2", or 145 to 157 centimeters. She weighed about 95 to 100 pounds, or 43 to 48 kilograms. Her hands had been tied behind her back, and her skull was missing from the scene. They would later estimate that she'd been there about a month. Once they found her, it obviously became very important that they find her missing skull, and they believed that they did. The crazy thing is that a skull was found pretty close to where she was, with no other remains with that. So then a pathologist named Ralph Erdman would go on to state that he was 95% certain that the skull that was found in Scottsdale matched the Plainview set of remains, based on similarities and the postmortem interval. The thing about this, though, is that Ralph Erdman, the man who determined this, he shortly after this would face his own scandal, and it kind of ripped apart all of the cases that he'd worked on. For about a decade, he did over 3,000 autopsies, and he made about $150,000 a year doing so. Maybe a little more, like 140. This was in the 80s, in the early 90s. That's a lot of money, especially when you consider that it was all a lie, or at least a lot of it was. What happened is he was really well respected until 1991, and then he did an autopsy on a man named Robert Craig Newman. That man's autopsy included the weight of his spleen and his gallbladder. But the problem being, when a family member viewed the results of his autopsy, he knew that Robert Newman did not have a spleen. So it included a weight of something that wasn't there. So after this allegation was made, they exhumed the man's remains, and what they discovered was that an autopsy hadn't even been performed. The man's body was buried intact. Not even one cut had been made. So now they were worried about how competent he was and about fraud in all of the cases that he'd worked on. And it also came out that he had actually misplaced the head of someone else. And in that case, the head that disappeared had the bullet. That meant the cause of death disappeared too. As a result, the perpetrator got off scot-free. The evidence was gone. Around this time, Lubbock County started being targeted with lawsuits, and the county would pay out several times. They discovered there were falsified records that led to a man going to prison for the accidental drowning of an infant. Another man was on death row for 2 years based on testimony from Erdman that was later proven to be false. There's probably so much more than is even known, too. So usually I'm more forgiving about people who, in doing the estimates, gave a wrong race, but in this case, there's no way to even assume that it was in good faith. So as a result, because they said that the remains was that of a white woman, Debra Mackey's family went 41 years without knowing what happened to her. And maybe it didn't have to. Who knows if he even actually examined the skull. Erdman would eventually plead no contest to 7 felony charges. He got probation and community service. He paid a mere $17,000 for botching autopsies and lying about them. And this was in part to cover the cost of those they had to exhume to try to piece together what his incompetency had done. But that's just a small amount of money if you consider what they paid out in addition to his large salary. So they would eventually do DNA testing on our Jane Doe here. But before they even did that, in 2015, the quick examination already concluded it was a black female. And then once the DNA was done, it proved that second examination was correct. They had a hard time getting DNA that was suitable for genetic genealogy, but they did eventually successfully get it. Along the way, they had already begun to suspect, after the race was changed, that the young Jane Doe was in fact Debra Terrell, and this would eventually be proven true. Deborah was just 20 years old when she disappeared from Lubbock, Texas, on New Year's Day, 1981. She had gone to a party at her mother's house on the 1700 block of Avenue E. At the end of the night, she was observed getting into a car with an unknown man around 2 a.m. He wasn't somebody who'd been at the party, and no one knows for sure who it was. When she was last seen, she had on a checkered brown coat, green pants, and she was wearing a bandana on her head. It's not clear if she was still married at the time, but 20-year-old Deborah had been married at a very young age. She was 15 when she had a child with a man who was much, much older. Deborah's family insisted from the beginning that she would never walk away from her child, who at this time was in elementary school. They were adamant that something bad had happened to her, but the police, for their part, settled on a theory that she'd walked away from her life, changed her name, and was living somewhere else. But there was no proof of this. They did eventually waver on this theory years and years later after Deborah never contacted anyone in her family again. In the following years, the police themselves began to suspect she was a victim of foul play. Although her remains were found really close by, the misidentification based on race meant that nobody considered that Deborah had already been found. Unfortunately, no one knew that the coroner was incompetent. So exactly what happened to her, we don't know. We don't know if the COD's been identified, but if it has, they haven't released it. They do say that it was foul play. There's also a reward for the identification or arrest of the people involved. Please call the crime line that is listed here if you know anything at all about this case. You can always leave anonymous tips with these police departments too if you don't want anyone to know who you are. Debra Mackey has gone unidentified for 41 years. Had she lived the life she deserved, she'd be 61 years old today. The Lovelock Jane Doe, identified as Florence Charleston. This story begins on October 26, 1978. An individual was walking along the north side of Scosa Road, about 40 feet off of the actual road itself. This was near Lovelock, Nevada. It was here that they spotted a folding bag that was partially buried. What they had actually found was the remains of a woman who had originally been buried inside of a shallow grave. This is probably a good time to remind people that when they're out walking in areas that are off the beaten path, please always keep an eye out. The truth is that so many of these John and Jane Does are found by accident. So in this case, the Pershing County Sheriff's Office responded to the scene, and they noted that skeletal remains were located inside of a garment bag buried in a shallow grave. Investigators collected a variety of evidence that was found at the scene, including women's clothing. Her remains were taken to Reno, Nevada, where an autopsy was performed. Investigators would conclude that she was white and likely around 40 to 50 years old. Unfortunately, the COD could not be determined. They tried really hard to identify her, but it just didn't happen. In May of 1979, the Pershing County Sheriff's Office requested help from the state in hopes that maybe they could identify her. The Nevada Department of Public Safety Investigations Divisions then took up the identification, or at least the attempt to. They used dental records for comparison purposes, and they tried to reach out to local area dentists in hopes she would be identified, but it didn't happen. They then did a facial reconstruction, and once advances happened, they processed her DNA and uploaded it into NamUs. They then diligently followed up on all the tips that were submitted. They'd done pretty much all they could, but they hit a wall, so they eventually sought out the assistance of Othram Labs. And of course, Othram is behind so many of these identifications. In June of 2023, they finally had her name. Florence Charleston was from Cleveland, Ohio, but she had just recently moved to Portland, Oregon, and this was where she went missing in 1978. And of course, now we know this is the same year that her remains were found in Lovelock, Nevada. It's not clear how she got from point A to point B, but the two locations are a distance of about 574 miles, or 924 kilometers. In 1978, this might as well have been another country because there were no centralized databases. The different jurisdictions just did the best that they could. A really sad part of this case is that her immediate family passed in the years that went by without knowing what happened to her. Her niece is still alive, though, and she believes that she was around 18 when her father told her that her Aunt Florence, who she called Aunt Dolly, had moved to Oregon, and that she had moved with a new boyfriend. This would mean it was in the early 1970s, which would leave a gap of around 8 years, if she's remembering the timeline correctly. She believes that no one in her family heard from Aunt Dolly again from that point on, saying that she's always remembered Aunt Dolly fondly over the years and wondered about her, hoping that she was happy and safe, saying all these questions I had, and it turns out she was dead. Florence's remains were found in October of 1978. Her niece says her Aunt Dolly would have been about 68 years old, which is, of course, older than the estimation that was given. Though it's possible she had passed during that gap, and that she had just been there longer than is known. Her niece shared that a Nevada State Police detective called her, saying that he'd taken over a cold case in October of 2022. He explained to her that it had been dormant for 40-plus years, and he wanted to ask her about a set of 45-year-old human remains that had been found. And her immediate response was to ask if he'd found her Aunt Dolly. It was shortly after this that a DNA test from Florence's niece was provided to Othram Labs, and it was declared that her Aunt Dolly had finally been found. Her niece would say this fired her up with hopes that she will learn what happened to Dolly. Florence Charleston went unidentified for 44 years. The Clairborne County Jane Doe, identified as Jerry Harrison. In August of 1986, some hunters were walking along an abandoned trail located in the Caney Valley area of Clairborne County, Tennessee. It was here that hunters located skeletal remains, and it prompted them to immediately contact the Clairborne County Sheriff's Office. And they, in turn, contacted the Tennessee Bureau of Investigations. The Jane Doe was wearing dark jeans, size 30 by 20, gold socks, and a white t-shirt with green sleeves in a size medium. They would estimate the man was around 30 to 40, and that he'd been there about 6 months. The COD was attributed to a GS wound. The man was entered into the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System in 2008. In 2015, the authorities would move to submit to the University of North Texas Center for Human Identification samples of his remains in hopes of getting DNA. And they did get it, but that's not the kind of DNA that they do genetic searches with. This specific DNA is uploaded into CODIS, and then it's compared with various samples that come through. So when this didn't work, they had to resubmit in hopes of getting DNA that was suitable for genetic genealogy. They began getting hits and leads off the genealogical research, and generally how it works is that they identify a more distant relative, approach them, and they start working forward. Sometimes they'll get a sample and realize it's not the right branch, and then they go and work on another branch. So it's really extensive, and that's why it takes so long. Eventually, however, it led to 2 individuals who would tell investigators that they had a brother they had not seen or heard from in 4 decades. They provided their own DNA, which then confirmed they had finally found Jerry Harrison, who was just 28 years old when his life was taken. It's unknown, or at least not reported, why or how he ended up in Clairborne County, Tennessee, from his home in Little Rock, Arkansas. The 2 locations are a distance of about 1,116 kilometers or 631 miles. They now need people to come forward who know something about his life and can help break the case as to what may have happened to him. If anyone has any information, you can call 1-800-TBI-FIND. Not only does he deserve his name, he deserves justice. You can always leave an anonymous message. Jerry Harrison went unidentified for 37 years. Had he lived, he would be 65 years old today. The Llano Jane Doe, identified as Pamela Mitchell. On June 14, 1991, a woman was discovered in Llano, California. She was wearing blue jeans and a pink and beige colored Gitano brand long-sleeve sweatshirt. She had in stud earrings and they were set with a clear stone. Someone had dug a shallow hole and then covered her with a tarp. A wooden slat was at the end of the tarp, so it's thought that maybe the tarp itself was used in rear covering on a military type of vehicle. As a result, she was found pretty quickly, and her COD is not listed. They believe she was a black female who was around 30 to 45, estimating her at 5'1" to 5'3", or 155 to 160 centimeters, with short, curly brown or black hair. Her weight was likely 160 to 220 pounds, or 73 to 100 kilograms. We know now that the woman was 31 years old. On October 6, 1990, Pamela left her home on the 6300 block of Lancashire Boulevard in Los Angeles. She told the people at home she was just heading down the street to see a friend, and then she just disappeared. There's no indication of who she went to see or if that person acknowledged her arrival. While she went missing from Los Angeles, she was found in Llano, but that's not very far away. It's just about 12 miles or 19 kilometers. Unfortunately, the investigation has hit a brick wall. If anyone knows anything, please call the number on the screen. Pamela Ann Mitchell went unidentified for 32 years. She actually went unidentified for 1 year longer than she was allowed to spend on this earth. Had she lived the life she deserved, she would be 63 years old today. The Belglade Jane Doe, identified as Douglas Lynn Streeter. This story begins in 1976 in Belglade, Florida, and this was off State Highway number 827 near the Talisman Farms area. Upon examination, it was determined he was a muscular man with an overbite who was likely 21 to 35. They believed he was either white or Native American. They placed his height at around 5'6" to 5'8", which is about 167 to 173 centimeters. He had brown hair and brown eyes. They also noted he had cartilage damage to his knees and lower back. He was wearing a Timex watch with the initials LJ carved on the underside. This is one of those things that sometimes makes identification hard, because it's natural to assume those were probably his initials, and as it turns out, they were not. His COD was attributed to a GS, but there's no clues as to who did this or why. The magic of Othram Labs is responsible for this one also. We know that while the watch had the initials LJ, his name was actually Douglas Streeter, and he was from Bryan, Ohio. Douglas had traveled to Florida from home with a group of friends either in March or April of 1976. It appears they had been staying at the Spanish Oak Apartments in Boca Raton, and this was the last place that he was seen. Douglas went by the nickname of Strut, and he had just seemingly disappeared. They did say that he had ties to North Adams, Michigan, and for a time there was a thought he might have headed back there. In reality, we know now he was found 6 months later, 60 miles or 96 kilometers away from where he went missing. Sadly, both his parents and his brother passed away during the years it took to find his name, so they never knew what happened to him. Now that he's finally been identified, the authorities are looking for a way to find out who did this, and they need someone to come forward with information. Please call the number on the screen if you know anything. Douglas Lynn Streeter went unidentified for 46 years. Had he lived, he would be 75 years old today. Huge thanks for watching all the way to the end, and a big thanks to all of you who consistently like and comment on the videos. Whether you leave a full comment or an emoji, it makes a huge difference. The whole dance with YouTube is hard sometimes. I gain only about 350 subs a month. So if you consistently watch my videos, maybe take a moment to subscribe. It's a huge push toward the videos being suggested to new people. The next goal is 20,000. Thanks everyone for watching. Take care of yourselves and each other.